all you Friday Lunch listeners. This is David Kiger, Theological Librarian at Emmanuel. As a bit of bonus content, here's a conversation I had with Phil Kennison, Emmanuel alum and Associate Dean of Bible and Ministry at Milligan University. Back in November, Phil and I sat down to talk about the 20-year impact of his book, Life on the Vine, Cultivating the Fruit of the Spirit in Christian Community. I hope you enjoy. Today our guest is Dr. Phil Kennison. Phil is the Associate Dean of the School of Bible and Ministry, Professor of Theology and Philosophy, Area Chair of Biblical Learning, and the Kenneth E. Starkey Chair of Bible and Christian Ministries at Milligan University. Phil holds degrees from Butler University, Emmanuel Christian Seminary, formerly Emmanuel School of Religion, and Duke University. For the past 26 years, he has had the privilege of teaching Milligan's capstone course, Christ and Culture, to graduating seniors. He's the author or co-author of several books, including the one we will talk about today, Life on the Vine, Cultivating the Fruit of the Spirit in Christian Community. This book was published in 1999 and has since been translated into Spanish, Chinese, and Korean. Phil, thank you for being here and talking with me today. I'm honored and grateful that you're willing to do this.
Well, thanks, Dave. I'm glad to be here. It's a privilege to talk with you about the book.
So, I guess we'll just jump in.
Sure.
The idea for this discussion happened just over a year ago. We were waiting for a lecture to begin in the chapel. It was a Tom Long lecture, and you had mentioned that it had been 20 years since Life on the Vine was published, and that kind of shocked me, like just that it had been this long. And you had casually mentioned that there were some things you wish you could update now, and so I'm excited to hear from you about what you think those issues are and what you might change. Having recently read it, I found it to be very current, and perhaps that's the ability you have to discuss the human nature so accurately. So my first question is, why this book? What drove you to write it?
Yeah, thanks. What might surprise some people is I didn't start off to write a book on the fruit of the Spirit. What I really wanted to do was giving the bulk of my teaching at Milligan is the senior course that tries to help students sort of hone their skills in sort of thinking theologically and also becoming more acutely aware of the way society and cultures form us. And so that's my sort of double task, is to get them to be sort of theologically astute and also a little bit more astute at looking and honestly being critical about the culture that's shaping us. And so really it was a kind of strategic decision, because I found out my first few years of teaching that, like my own upbringing, I hadn't been taught to think very critically about American culture except in just a few areas. And I had been convinced for some time that there's a lot of things in American culture that make it hard, that run counter to following Jesus. But I knew my students and potential readers would be resistant to that notion, so I was trying to think through, how just rhetorically I could help people make it harder for them to resist that. And I thought, there's few things in the Christian life that seem like they're unarguable than that the goodness of the fruit of the Spirit. I mean, most of us learned little songs when we were young, and I don't think anyone thinks that the fruit of the Spirit is just ancillary to the Christian life. So I guess I thought that if I could show people how aspects of American culture are potentially obstacles or inhibit the growth of the Spirit, that would be more difficult for them to just sort of dismiss the cultural critique. And so it was my way of trying to kind of bring cultural critique in the back door, so to speak, and not make it the only thing, but give it a real kind of rootedness in Scripture and the Christian tradition. So that's why, again, start off thinking the world needed another book on the fruit of the Spirit, but thought that maybe that way in might serve my purposes of getting readers and my students, even though my students don't read the book, but people like my students, give them an opportunity to think through and hang with me long enough on the cultural critique without just kind of dismissing it out of hand.
You mentioned that the challenges that any culture presents, this is a quote, the challenges that any culture presents to faithful embodiments of the gospel will always be changing. Do you think, in what ways do you think American culture has shifted in the last 20 years? And has that changed your perception of how the fruit of the Spirit function as a critique of that culture?
Yeah, I mean, when you and I first talked, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to come out with a new edition of the book was it's the kind of book, I knew when I was writing it, that it was the kind of book to be true to what I wanted to do, that you'd probably have to write every 10 years. What actually surprised me about the book, one, I'm still surprised 20 years later it's still in print, and two, that I was surprised it was translated into very different cultures, because I certainly wasn't thinking about that when I was writing. To find out that it has a life now in China, in Korea, and in Spanish-speaking culture just kind of surprises me, because I'm always kind of curious, like, how that translate. I mean, it says something about the international, global culture that we have that does translate out. But there certainly has been lots of things that have changed. I mean, surely when when I think about the book, or I hear from people who've read it, there are certain kind of examples that, just don't seem, the technology has certainly changed. And so those kind of things I'd like to go back and change in them. But as far as the fundamental analysis, I think the examples change, but I think fundamentally the book, because the fruit of the Spirit don't change. I mean, I think because the fruit of the Spirit are themselves something so central to the Christian life. I mean, they are marks of the Spirit's animation in our lives. That hasn't changed. And so, if anything, it feels like they're every bit as much needed. I mean, the fruit are needed. But in every culture and every time and place, there would be different challenges to what inhibits the fruit of the Spirit. And what I tried to do in the book is be pretty clear that I wasn't trying to say these are the inhibiting factors. I was just trying to train people to see in any given time and place that there might be things that inhibit the cultivation and nurturing of those fruit in our lives. And so once you're sort of attuned to that way of thinking theologically, I think you're more aware in any given time and place of what they might be. So they're always going to change, and even within subcultures, I'm certainly not saying that every Christian who lives in America has to deal with these things. I'm just saying you wouldn't be surprised to bump into these obstacles in cultures like ours. But yeah, certainly all the kinds of things that contemporary technology, the internet exploded over the last 20 years. Social media was not a thing when I wrote the book. It's hard to imagine all the things that we just think of as been here forever 20 years ago. And I was writing the book 25 years ago. I mean, they just weren't on the landscape at all.
Right, 9/11.
A lot has changed.
I mean, yeah, now we have college students who were born after 9/11 even happened.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh my.
It's a different world. It really is a different world. And for good or ill. For good and ill. I mean, there are some really good things that have happened over the last 20 years, but there are also some things that create new challenges for living a life animated by the Spirit, for sure.
Yeah, I can't imagine, just writing something 25 years ago and then seeing how it's still being used, and you have these examples that you use that you thought were going to be current and they're not anymore.
Right.
Yeah, but I didn't notice that as a problem reading it in 2020, which is a testament, I think, to your work. So the book itself, you kind of pit the fruit of the Spirit, or put the fruit of the Spirit against different aspects of American culture, aspects that don't, in and of themselves, lead to a holy, virtuous life. You mentioned addiction, market style exchange, fragmentation, self-sufficiency, among others. Would you change any of those vices that you used, or maybe add some?
Yeah, I'm not sure those obstacles have necessarily faded. I think sometimes there are other ones that you feel like somehow have greater currency, and you feel them as more major threats. I think one of the ones that I sense now that I didn't sense then is, particularly in my students, but not just in my students, I feel a kind of rampant cynicism and hopelessness, despair. It just makes it hard. Hard to give yourself to anything. There's this kind of reserve in people. Has a lot to do with not being able to trust anyone or anything. You as a librarian know, trying to get information to people's I wouldn't say vigilance, because it's not really vigilance. It's just deep skepticism about anything. And so everything just feels like it's held in reserve. And I don't know how to follow Jesus that way, where everything's held back. And I don't know how to give room for the Spirit to move in your life and animate your life if, again, everything's held in reserve, if you're just a cynic about everything, anything that's said, any claim that's made on your life potentially, or anything that someone encourages you to think about, then everyone just begins thinking about all the reasons why people's motivations could just be deeply dark and twisted, which is not news to Christians. This is true, but to start from that premise and find it so difficult to move from that spot and to feel, I feel bad. I mean, I really feel deeply grieved for what feels like a generation that, for some of them anyway, that just seems like their whole life is just kind of wrapped in despair. And again, when you think about what they've grown up with, and what has been going on in the world in sort of their formative years, it's not hard to see why that's the case. But yeah, I think if I were writing the book again today, I'd have to have, I've got the section on hope at the end, but that, even though hope doesn't come up specifically in Paul's list in Galatians, I think I'd have to have a way of talking more about that somewhere else in the book, or the ending would have to be longer, because it seems like hope is in short supply, and for so many people just seems like naivete.
You do mention fragmentation, and I think kind of at the root of some of this culturally is a fragmentation of our very being, in that we have virtual personas, that we have relationships with people on the internet where we don't interact in person, we don't know them, and we curate our personalities so it's just what we want them to see, and so I think, yeah, that might be an avenue as well in the book, is just this fragmentation is.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it is. We are fragmented, and you do have opportunities never before had by people, as you say, to sort of curate your identity in ways that, on the one hand, seem like such an advantage to the human person, and yet it creates skyrocketing rates of depression, because deep down inside we know that's not who we are, and we know no one actually knows who we are. And it seems like at the heart of the story that we're trying to embody is that we're loved even though we're known. We're deeply known. This deeply human quality that we have, this deep desire we have to be known, and yet we're afraid of being known, really known. And so we hide behind these avatars and these projections, and then we're just deeply lonely and self-alienated, I think.
Yeah. And have you noticed kind of a growth in your college students in depression? Like, would you say like 25 years ago, students were the same kind of depressed, or is it now just a very different situation or amount? Or
I think the level of depression is higher. I think the level of anxiety and anxiety disorders is remarkably high. And I think, again, that anxiety of just worrying what people think of us, because we know that in some ways we put our lives out there in social media, in a kind of public way. And so we know that people, there's this kind of voyeuristic kind of dimension to social media that we're kind of sucked into. We get to look into other people's lives, but then we're comparing our lives to their lives in ways that, again, are unprecedented. And it just seems like I don't remember, and I don't think I could have missed it, to have the kind of level of depression and anxiety in young people. It's really disturbing, and I feel like we're giving them a world that's toxic to them. And I'm not sure we're going to know it's such a relatively new way of life. I'm not sure we'll know the full fallout of it for some time, and I worry that we'll have damaged deeply at least a whole generation of people. They got to be the guinea pigs for our new toys.
Oh. Ooh. Well, let's maybe say, related to that then, what fruit of the Spirit should college students consider cultivating? Or would you, if you were to, not that you would want just one, but
Sure.
If there were one to kind of start with?
Yeah, I think one of the gifts that a younger generation in any age offers that's a gift that those of us who are older sometimes are threatened by, is a kind of urgency that they have. They see things, they want the world to be different. And that's a good thing. We need people who want the world to change. They see wrongs that need to be righted. And they have a certain passion and urgency about that. So that's the good thing. It's hard to be patient when you're in your 20s, and it's not necessarily a flaw at that age necessarily, but I do think they need to see the wisdom and the beauty and the character of God in patience with themselves even. There's a certain impatience with themselves, but certainly impatience with others. And again, it's a hard line to walk, because there are some things they should be impatient about, and there should be some urgency about. And I don't think it's just the case that I'm getting older and slower of necessity. But I get a sense that students, when they get a chance to slow down, and there are a couple things that we try to do in coursework even to try to get them to slow down, they will be the first to admit that have very little margin in their life. And I don't think you can talk about, I mean, I think of patience as sort of love in the dimension of time, that love has a pace, has a speed, and there's certain parts of life that you miss if your life is just frenetic. And most of them, because they're high achieving students, have lived their whole lives at kind of breakneck speed, and speed's a virtue in our culture, and it's hard to argue against that because almost everything's sold to us, partly on speed being. I sometimes think that if we had to rewrite 1 Corinthians 13 for Paul, these three remain: productivity, efficiency, and speed. But the greatest of these is speed. That those are the cardinal virtues in our day. And again, I don't blame young people for having. They have imbibed deeply at the waters that are available, and so. And they've succeeded because they have, right? And so there's that feedback loop. So but slowing down and trying to see what you're missing, just at a personal level. I mean, the kind of relationships that you're missing, the kind of life that you're missing, the beauty of life that you're missing. It's hard. It's a hard notion to think that God's not in a hurry. And yet we are a lot. And so I think gently cultivating the disposition of patience, the posture of patience, is one place to start. I rarely run across a young person who's overly patient. So I'm rarely overly patient. I mean, I think it's,
Yeah, that's a very poignant observation. I mean, I think this current pandemic has brought some of the speed and efficiency of life and productivity to a halt, in almost a corrective of sorts.
And it's also exposed by the subsequent depression that it's an important question to ask yourself: who are you when you come full stop? Which I think one of the gifts of Sabbath always was meant to be. I think one of the gifts of Sabbath was for God to remind us that the world gets along just fine without us. I'm not nearly as necessary for the running of the world as I like to convince myself I am, right? Which is why we all take it as a badge of honor that we're busy, right? I mean, when's the last time somebody asked you how you're doing, and you didn't say, or somebody didn't say, "Oh, I'm fine, just really busy." And we secretly think of being busy I think we do, as a kind of badge of honor. I mean, I've never once met somebody who said, and I asked, "How you doing?" And they said, "Oh, I'm just fine, just the perfect balance of things to do and time to do it." I mean, we would hate that person. Like, who are you? No, you're busy, right? Which is why so many of us have a hard time, myself included, saying no when we're asked to do things, because I like being needed. It makes me feel necessary to the running of the world. But the whole point of Sabbath was everything stopping. It's like, guess what? Just stop and ask yourself, who are you when you stop? How many people get lapse into deep depression when they retire because they don't know who they are? Really good Christian people I've talked to who've retired, and they just suffer immeasurably because their entire identity was wrapped around their productivity, and now they feel invisible. Like, who am I now? And we haven't been very good in the church about that. I'm not sure we've helped people very much thinking about through those things.
Well, mentioning the church brings up a good transition to the subtitle of your book is Cultivating the Fruit of the Spirit in Christian Community. And throughout the book, you argue, and I'll quote here, the most important venue for cultivating the fruit of the Spirit is the community gathered for worship. Related to this, I personally appreciate how you repeatedly note that the fruit of the Spirit is for the community, not simply the individual. It's the community who embodies these fruit. What strategies might you have to offer us in this time where communities are having a hard time gathering, and that cultivation is hindered potentially through the circumstances of a pandemic, not allowing group gatherings, not allowing, singing at a lot of places.
Yeah, no, it's hard. I appreciate you picking up on that emphasis, Dave, because I know when I was growing up and thinking about the fruit of the Spirit and hearing them mentioned, it always just, I think, you often learn things not by just what's said, but what isn't said. And so I think I was just always left to imagine these as sort of fruit that individual people cultivate, and as sort of your own personal piety to do what you can to cultivate those. But at the heart of I think, the best reading of the Christian faith and sort of Christian anthropology is that we're social beings through and through, created in the image of a God, a triune God. And so there's this social dimension to what it means to be human. And so if we're going to, in nurturing and having the fruit of the Spirit nurtured in our lives, then we shouldn't be surprised that the fruit themselves both reflect God's character, who is triune, but they also deepen our own humanity, because each of the fruit in some way sort of pull us out of ourselves. They're other directed. And so they pull us into community, and they're the very kinds of dispositions and virtues, if we want to use that language, that we need to live well and flourish with one another. And so they're not sort of individual virtues. That's even self-contradictory. I don't know what an individual virtue would be. An excellence for whom? Like just a personal excellence. But yeah, there's social dimensions. And so I think what we're wrestling with in the pandemic is, it's if nothing else, at a bare minimum, it should have been, as you were sort of parallel to your point about the way in which the pandemic has in some ways undermined our productivity and made us reflect on, who am I when I can't be productive, or who am I when I can't do the things I normally do. It's forced the church to say, who are we at our most essential? And it's been hard, because I think in a kind of twist that might be surprising to many of us, it seems to me, one of the things that I've noted is that we've been reminded of how important bodies are. And it seems to me, there seems some irony to me. It feels like irony to me. It might just be paradox, but I think it's irony that in our day, and maybe in the next 50 years, who knows, Christians might be the great defender of the human body. I'm not sure I would have predicted that 40 years ago, that we care about bodies, that we are incarnate, that God was incarnate, and incarnational life is the only life we know. And this is a beautiful life, a good life, and that we are embodied beings. And I think our embodiedness has been, the value of that has been heightened by not being able to gather bodily. And that seems to me related to a whole kind of sacramental existence where matter matters, right? And it's not a running away from the body or running away from matter, but that a sanctifying of matter and making it that matter, whether it's our own bodies or bread and wine, making of us more than we would otherwise be by the sanctifying work of the Spirit. And that's a communal process. And that's what we celebrate when we gather bodily together. And yeah, it feels like so many, I really grieve with and for our ministers and pastors who I think have to feel like skilled carpenters who have like one tool left in their toolbox and everything else has been stripped away, and they're trying to figure out, like, how do I build this congregation up when all I have is a Phillips screwdriver? Because so much of what we do requires some type of physical presence at its best. And we've tried to use what we can, and I think we've learned some good things. But I think if there is a silver lining, I think one of the things that good has come from it is it has sent us back to some language that we use a lot, but or at least parrot a lot, but maybe haven't embodied a lot, and that's things like, the priesthood of all believers. I think a lot of people had to be priests to their neighbors and priests to certain people in their congregation that they committed to keep up with when the ministerial staff couldn't possibly check in with everybody because you don't even see them.
And it would be harmful if they even did.
Yeah, absolutely. But at least you could at least, and again, I think that priesting happened when we gathered, but I think we undervalued it. I just think about congregations where there's whole swaths of the population, mainly more elderly and frail people who feel more exposed and vulnerable, who haven't been inside of a church building for months and months and months. And so very few people have laid eyes on them in their congregation. And so people have had to find other ways to connect with those people. And again, laying eyes on them on a Sunday morning wasn't everything, but at least you knew they were okay enough to be there. And now we don't know. I can show up on a service with 40 people in a congregation on Sunday, but there's a couple hundred people that I'm not seeing, and I haven't seen, and I have no idea how they are, unless somebody's checking in and being very intentional about making sure that people are okay when we don't in our everyday lives kind of bump into each other with more regularity. And so I'm grateful for congregations who have tried to be intentional about that, the need to check in with people and have kind of overlapping layers of responsibility for people to make sure that there aren't just people out there sitting in their homes with no human contact. So yeah, it's a challenge for sure.
Yeah, the raising up of the priesthood of all believers, I appreciate that in that it creates almost a more participatory act of worship than our typical Sundays. And I'd say most churches in America, like Sunday service, doesn't have a lot of participation from the average person in the pew. It has some, but not like a real back and forth engagement. This requires a different level of personal involvement. And so, yeah, I think that's great.
And I don't think we noticed. I think what it has done, I think we had an idea maybe of what we were doing on Sunday morning. and the relative importance of different things of our gathering. But I think this has drawn some things into relief in a different way. I mean, I can tell you the first time I gathered in a space, in a congregation, after several months of just having virtual worship. The first time I was in that space and was able to sing with other people. I could hardly sing. I was just weeping, right? And I didn't even really know why. I wasn't even prepared. I was so surprised by it. I was just overtaken by it. It took me a while to kind of even process, like, why am I so overwhelmed by just being in this space with 40 other people? And it was just the sense that, that had been taken away, and I didn't realize how powerful it was to share space together bodily, and to have your collective attention drawn to a kind of single focus, and in worship, and just to be grateful for the people around you who you had shared common conviction with. And yeah, I think I'm not likely to take that for granted anytime soon, but I'm sure I surely did, because I wasn't, on an average morning when I was Sunday morning gathering, I wasn't thinking that was in the top 3 or 4 things that I was doing when I was gathering, until it was gone. And then I was like, oh, I need that. That's a really central thing that we do, and I'm less without that.
Yeah, the isolation has highlighted our need for other people in ways we couldn't have predicted. It just speaks to the truth that the Christian community is a community. Yeah. And as you note, love is kind of the organizing principle of this Christian community and the fruit of the Spirit, and is other directed. As you look at our present world, aside from the pandemic, just come off an election, I think about how the book gets published the year before the 2000 election with the hanging chads. I mean, like 20 years ago, and we're experiencing that again in a different way right now. We have people filled with anger, mistrust, even among Christians. I've heard, and I don't know the source, but that people feel that their political party affiliation is a stronger connection than their church associations. How do you encourage preachers to talk about this love of God that's other directed in congregations that might be what we would call purple? What do preachers need to hear about the fruit of the Spirit and how to preach it, or maybe just how to live it?
Yeah. Well, certainly one of the things I do in the book, as I've kind of alluded to before, is try to put the fruit themselves in a larger context, that they're not just about themselves, that they bear witness to God's character, right? That they tell us something about the nature of the kingdom, the life that we all say we want human flourishing. Well, what's that look like? What does human flourishing look like? And I think Christians have some language to put around that a life that is exhibiting these fruit of the Spirit and is animated by the Spirit of Jesus is a life well lived, precisely because it's not centered on the self, but is other directed and animated by something outside of one. And I think a similar thing needs to happen there. And so it seems like, let's trying to think about what the church is. I mean, I think rather than just talking about the fruit themselves, which might be too small a canvas to paint on if you weren't already framing it larger, just trying to help people think what the church is, because in American culture, the church is already framed culturally as a kind of interest group, because that's what people participate in when they're not grouped involuntarily. You know, if you're grouping yourself voluntarily, then you're grouping yourself with like-minded people. And if the church, as part of its witness in the world to a social order, which I take the kingdom of God to be, that's bigger than the church, then it seems to me we have to help people recapture the notion of even what the church is, that it's not an institution that's there primarily to offer you programs and give you, to serve you, which is again serve a certain group of like-minded individuals who want certain religious products. And so the church becomes a vendor of religious services. And if that's what if that's what you think you're joining, then you want certain kind of services that are tailored to your own preferences, whatever those are, including maybe political preferences. Mm-hmm. So you want certain sermons that are tilted certain kinds of ways that sort of reinforce your own political proclivities. And if they don't, then you'll go somewhere else where they do, because it's the market. That's what the market is, even in religious products.
And there are options.
There are options. There are lots of options. And so somehow we have to, and this is a larger question than just the political question, but the political question falls on it. I mean, there's no reason to think if you grew up in American culture, unless somebody worked really hard to shape your idea of what the church was, you'd have a warped notion of what the church is about, because it's already situated socially and culturally and framed badly by just the larger society of what it is. And so you have to work overtime as a minister or pastor to help your people see that this people gathering, these people are about something bigger than them, and that their loyalty is to something bigger than their own preferences and their own political loyalties. And if your loyalties, your political loyalties, don't bow to this Christ the King, as we're coming up to Christ the King week in the church year, then the church has failed you in helping you to see what it means to be a follower of Jesus, because this is the Jesus to which all loyalties must bow, including your political loyalties, or your other political loyalties. That's a hard sell, but I don't know how it doesn't seem even negotiable. I mean, if you can't find a way in a particular setting, and again, it has to be done judiciously depending on the congregation that you're in, but if you can't speak that truth, then I don't know. It just seems like everything else is then the whole Christian project is just going to collapse into nothing more than private piety, to which the church is there to support you.
I wonder what the role globalism kind of can help in this. I remember growing up being told, like, America, love it or leave it. This was at my little Christian high school. And the irony is my mom is not an American-born person. She's a citizen now, but she was a citizen of another country before. And so I've always had this tension and like, well, it's not just America. There's other places that God is working. Do you think globalism, because I don't think it's going away anytime soon, even though some political forces are trying to limit it, I think we've kind of crossed a Rubicon there. How might globalism help impact this revisioning of the church?
No, that's a great question. Yeah, I've thought for some time that maybe, going back to patience, I've often thought that if the Spirit is going to begin a new reformation of the church in the United States, or even in the the Christian North, that it will likely come from our brothers and sisters in so-called developing countries, or at least the global South. And it may be that what we should be doing, if you're, I mean, or one, I don't make it sound like it's the exclusive task or the only task, but it may be that one task that pastors and ministers might be thinking about is how do we shape a people with enough humility who will be able to receive the gospel anew when it comes? Because I think it's coming, but I'm just not sure we're ready for it. I'm not sure we're ready. I'm not sure we have any kind of posture of receptivity. I think we're such a proud people that the idea that we would be evangelized by the people that we badly evangelized, and that the Spirit took our, what in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases was a twisted gospel, and refined it and brought it back to our shores for our good. Do we have the humility to receive it? It's kind of a haunting question for me. And it seems like that's one thing we might be preparing for. I doubt that we can fix ourselves. The twistedness is probably too deep.
Yeah.
Ooh, well, why don't we move towards another question?
Sure.
You make the observation that we, as a Christian community, have been freed. Actually, it's kind of related to your point about pride. To insist, quote, to insist that we are always right, and that this reality, being free from that, means we are allowed and encouraged to ask for forgiveness. Could you expand upon how you have seen the need to always be right negatively impact the Christian community?
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose some of that's just rooted in my own autobiography. I still, to this day, it's been well over 50 years, I still remember one of the most prophetic and probably helpful, but at the time, hard things to hear from my father growing up was more than once he said, you just always want to be right. And that wasn't a compliment, clearly. And I do like to be right. And I've also seen the damage that insisting that you're right. And so I'm grateful that the Spirit's worked in my life some over the years, the decades, to cultivate a little bit of humility in my life. But again, it's a social thing, right? I mean, humility is not just a personal virtue. I mean, it's hard to live with people. It's hard to live with anybody who doesn't have any humility. I mean, living together requires a deep sense of humility, a deep sense that you, that the other person in your household is a living, breathing mystery whose depths you cannot plumb no matter how many decades you live with them. And so, yeah, to leave room for intellectual humility, that we don't always have to have everything figured out. I mean, I do feel like again, go back to my point earlier that sometimes things that deeply form you are not just what you're taught explicitly, but sometimes by the silences. And so I think I grew up being a pretty self-assured Christian that we had most of the answers, we had most things figured out. And that the things we hadn't figured out just were because they weren't able to be figured out, but we pretty much figured out everything that could be figured out. And I don't feel that way anymore, thankfully. But yeah, I do feel like that sometimes we can come across to people outside of the church as people who have it all together and who don't have any lingering questions about much of anything. That we feel like our task is, we have been given the answers, and our task is to make sure we deliver them to you. And I think that kind of lack of humility is dangerous in a world where people have all kinds of questions that they're seeking conversation around, and they're looking for people who are willing to be honest about their questions and their doubts. And I even know I grew up thinking that doubt was the great enemy of the faith. I no longer think that. And so, yeah, I think if I'm in a church where it feels like, I mean, it's hard to imagine you have a church. You go back to your example of the purple church, painted purple. I mean, if everyone in there thinks they've got everything figured out and there's no humility, and everybody thinks they just have, the truth with a capital T in their back pocket, it's hard to imagine how that goes well. And so I think humility would go a long way. And you can't, it's pretty hard. I mean, the reason it's connected with forgiveness, it's pretty hard to ask. I mean, asking for forgiveness is a pretty humbling thing, because it means that you erred, that you made a mistake, that you sinned, that you fell short. And I remember, back when I was in grad school, I attended a Presbyterian church, and one of the things that they did every Sunday, which I hadn't seen until I was in the Presbyterian church, was when we came to corporate confession, everyone squeezed in between. The pews weren't set up for kneelers; they didn't have kneelers, but everyone was squeezed down in their pew to get on their knees. 300 or 400 people, that kind of leveling. We all got on our knees to admit and to pray, not just to confess our own sins, but to confess our collective sins as a community. And that to me would be another goal. Would be to have a congregation that has enough of a corporate identity where you could make sense of naming collectively your failures as a congregation. I think a lot of congregations would have a hard time doing that. Maybe just because they haven't tried. But could we name that our failings as a church is not simply the sum total of our individual failures, but we as a people have failed to be who God's called us to be in this place? Could we bring that to speech? That would take humility, but it also would require a sense of our identity as a people. And so I think both of those things, if we're going to kind of recover the church as a people that have an identity, collective identity as a community, then one of the reasons we need that is so that we can confess our own shortcomings and acknowledge that. And I often think that the rap that Christians get about being self-righteous would feel differently if people stepped into our midst and saw us all on our knees on a Sunday morning. Acknowledging that we're falling far short of what God wants of us, because I don't think people see that much of anywhere else. We're the ones standing up, telling other people why they're wrong. I think that's the at least impression that people get of us. And I think that's hard to receive in a world where a lot of people are asking honest questions. And I'm not sure we're in a posture to be in conversation with a lot of them.
Thank you. On a lighter question, if you could go back in time 25 years and talk to yourself about writing this book, what would you tell yourself?
Yeah, probably to forego really specific cultural examples. Like don't name movies that have come out in the last year that probably will have a shelf life of about 6 months. Just because it's going to make people are going to, I have no idea what that movie is. Why did he mention that? It's a really bad idea. yeah, I didn't expect the book to have a shelf life of 20 years. So, but if I did, I would have probably chosen my examples differently. Yeah. Other than that, I mean, I think that's the main thing I probably would think about as far as just writing the book. But I had a lot of good help. I mean, one of the things that I was pleased about the book is that it was, I mean, my name's on the front, but they're, like most books, they don't come about in a vacuum. And a lot of good people helped me, including, you may have noticed in the acknowledgments that Professor Miriam Perkins helped me a great deal in that book. She was one of the people who sat in the class that I taught around this when I was trying to churn out manuscripts each week, a chapter a week, just trying to write through some stuff, and her comments and suggestions and those of others. So I'd go back and say, you know, get more good people, because I had really good people, but I'm sure if there are shortcomings, it's because I didn't get enough good help. But it was a group project for sure. I couldn't have done it without a lot of really, really good people.
Awesome. Well, last question I've got for you is, you end your book by mentioning the Christian responsibility to hope. And I guess it's two questions, so kind of lied there. But what gives you hope for the future of the church? And what are some practices that you engage in, or that you would suggest others engage in, to cultivate hope?
Yeah. Hope on some days feels like it's in short supply, doesn't it? And yet, the Christian tradition is pretty clear that despair is not an option for us, even though we might be tempted to despair. I do think taking it goes back connected to patience in some ways. I think hope requires you to take the long view, to not always trust what you see in front of you in the moment is everything there is to take into account, even though if it seems really pressing or depressing. To try to take the longer view, and believe that God is at work in the world, especially when I can't see it. It's easy to hope, or it's easy to be confident in the work of God when I can see the traces of God's work. But most of us know that, I think, through life experience, that God's providence is seen retrospectively, rarely in the moment, and so that itself urges us to take the longer view, that probably you can't tell what's going on right now, and don't assume that you have to see it right now. And I think if you think of, to go back to the horticultural image of the fruit of the Spirit, a lot of us are planting seeds that we're never going to see the fruit of. That's the way it works. And because a lot of us are reaping what other people sowed, right? I am the beneficiary of seeds planted across generations of faithful Christians who did not see the fruit of their labors. And so why should it be different for me? No reason to do that. And so if I'm a parent wondering on a day-to-day basis, like, what is all this effort for? I can't really see what it's doing in our children. Or if you're teaching and you stand in a classroom, and at the end of the day, you can't tell that it made any difference. There are days I just want to go out and, rake the leaves in my lawn, because when I'm done I can tell I did something. But a lot of us are called to do things that bear fruit over a lot longer period of time, and the kind of hope and trust and faith in God's work in and through us when we can't really see what's going on requires a kind of longer view. And so I think, some of the practices are just kind of reminding yourself of how, this is why you have church history and other kinds of things. I mean, this is developed over time, and God has been in it through good and bad, through beautiful things and horrible things, and we continue to hope and trust that God will bring to fruition that which God has begun and promised to bring. And some days we'll see glimpses of God's work and glimpses of the fruit that's being born in and through our lives. And lots of days will just be, what we'll have is hope. And what we'll have is trust that God's not abandoned us. God still is at work in the world, in us and through us. And we continue to pray the Spirit animates our lives to make that true in a way that maybe other people later can see in ways that we can't.
Well, thank you, Phil. That was wonderful. Thank you again for being here. Any last words you want to share with us?
I don't think so, Dave. Thanks so much for the opportunity to just think out loud with you and talk through some things that I think we both deeply care about, and other people do as well. So appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you for listening, folks. Again, we've been talking with Phil Kennison about his book, Life on the Vine, Cultivating the Fruit of the Spirit in Christian Community. It is still being printed. It's still available widely on the internet and in bookstores. Go get yourself a copy and read it. This has been the Theological Resource Podcast, an initiative of the Ministry Resource Center for Emmanuel Christian Seminary at Milligan.